a girl suddenly vanished from her bedroom in the middle of the night. The police sought out searching for her, and eventually she was found. However, finding her led to a revelation that seemed unbelievable and shocking to the ears of all who heard of it. On April 11, 1998, a girl named Rowan Ford was born in San Diego, California. Her parents had divorced when she was very young, so her mother Colleen had to move with her to Stella, a small town located in Missouri. Soon after, Colleen met a man named David Spears, and they got married soon enough. Over the course of their marriage, they had a daughter, which summed up all of Rowan's siblings to 6, from different fathers, of course. But this didn't affect Rowan's bond with her step-siblings, as she loved them so very dearly. For leisure, Rowan spent a sizable amount of time riding her bike around town and swimming. She had a strong passion for art, and she also loved helping kids with their tasks at a local Sunday school where she acted as a volunteer. Rowan was seen as an independent girl, owing to the fact that her mom worked night shift at a store, and her stepfather spent most of his time on the farm. But this routine was about to cost them dearly. On November 2nd, 2009, Rowan, who was already 9 years old and in 4th grade at her local elementary school, was left alone at night while her parents went about their normal routine, which involved them sleeping out most times, and something unexpected happened. Colleen, Rowan's mom, who usually came back in the morning, returned at 9 a.m., as was her usual routine. But there happened to be a particular twist to this routine. Rowan wasn't present in her room, but what shocked Colleen the most was her husband's response when she asked him the whereabouts of their child. When he was asked, David Spears admitted to letting her sleep over at a friend's place, but he forgot to ask which friend's place exactly she would be sleeping at. Usually, this wasn't a cause for worry, as the town was very small, with everyone familiar with each other. But Colleen, who was already in a state of panic, decided to search for her daughter in all the possible places she thought she'd be in. She searched extensively. Thankfully, as we said before, the town wasn't so big, so in no time, she had discovered that her daughter was nowhere to be found. She rushed back home to her husband and made a report about the situation to him, urging him to inform the police of the developments. He reacted with disdain and showed a lack of interest, urging her that everything was fine, and their daughter would come back home to them. Initially, she obeyed her husband by staying put and calm for a while, but after several hours had passed, and there was no knock at the door or any mom calls of her lost child, Colleen decided to take the matter into her own hands by informing the police by herself. This she did by dialing 911, and the local sheriff responded in no time. In a swift response to the situation, the police organized a search party immediately. They also questioned anyone who they felt could have useful information about the disappearance, and this included David Spears, Rowan's stepfather, who was confirmed to be the last person that saw her before the disappearance. David stated that his friends Christopher Collins and Nathan Mahurin came over to his place that fateful day, and they all agreed to play some games and take a couple of drinks at David's apartment, spending a greater part of the night having a lot of fun, after which Christopher asked Nathan to drive him home, where he packed his trailer. However, they still managed to convince David to come with them and continue the party, and he agreed. David left with his friends immediately, but only after confirming that Rowan was still in her room and asleep. Afterwards, they stopped to get more drinks on the way in order to continue their party. David drank for close to an hour before finally persuading Nathan to take him back home. Nathan, who was as drunk as the others already, suggested they take a longer path, which would see them avoid any occurrence of police checks instead of taking the regular highway. Eventually, they got to their destination, which was David's house, where Nathan dropped him off and left immediately. David, who was already too drunk at the time, went to sleep almost immediately. However, his sleep was soon cut short by Rowan, who insisted she wanted to go over to a friend's place to pass the night. David, not knowing what friend, and not bothering to ask, immediately agreed, probably in a bid to hurriedly get back to sleep. But why would a young girl ask to sleep out in the middle of the night? The answer to this question remained a mystery to many who heard about the event. What was even more surprising was the fact the stepfather allowed her to go without caring to ask what friend she was going to meet exactly. This is where it gets tricky. The details of David's statement remained sketchy to the local sheriff, who felt there was more to the story than David was opening up. However, he had no evidence, so he had to approach the case the custom way, which involved continuing to search for the missing girl using the resources he had on the ground till night. Stella was a town which boasted not more than 150 people residing in it, so the news of Rowan missing spread quickly like wildfire. With the indigenes, who were in a state of fear, joining forces with the police in searching for her. Parents who used to let their children play outside without worries suddenly stopped the act when the news of the missing girl hit. The first day of the search yielded 0 results. Owing to the small size of the town, it had already been covered quickly, and the police had moved over to a neighboring town, where David's friend Christopher resided. He was promptly questioned about the event, and his story seemed to tally with that of his friend David. However, he expressed concern over the fact that he had 0 knowledge about the happenings, owing to the fact that his friend said nothing about it to him. The search for Rowan continued, with the police adding more volunteers and even employing the assistance of the FBI, all to no avail. There were no clues or leads, and it almost seemed as though the little girl had vanished. The police, however, were confirming their suspicions. Owing to the negative outcome of the search, detectives were highly suspecting that Rowan may have been adopted, and with her stepfather being the last to see her, and also the fact that his story didn't seem to add up, he became a huge suspect in the case. However, suspicions heightened up when authorities noticed irregularities in David's story from time to time. However, the FBI swung into investigation and discovered some shocking information. On the night of Rowan's disappearance, David had borrowed his mother's car, for a yet-to-be-identified reason. The FBI agents saw this as a red flag, and very sketchy, as David had initially withheld the information. This prompted them to immediately take custody of his mother's vehicle and his own pickup truck for examination. Still, no irregularities were noticed, so the mystery case remained unsolved. However, the police decided to carry out a very intelligent plan. The police detectives decided to carry out another questioning session on Christopher and Nathan, as they were the closest to the suspect on that day, and probably in a bid to detect any irregularities from the first story which they had been told. However, Christopher, when invited for questioning later that day, gave the exact same account, which he gave in the previous questioning. The police even had to resort to doing a polygraph test on him, and it turned out he was telling the truth. While going out of the police station, Christopher noticed an old family friend whom he had known for 17 years. His name was Sheriff Clark, head of the police department in a town called Whitten. He was well respected by Christopher, as his foster parents were close friends of the sheriff. The sheriff had also previously been of assistance to Christopher, especially when he had lost his mother. Christopher and the sheriff started talking about missing Rowan. However, the sheriff, probably owing to his experience, noticed some abnormal behaviors from Christopher. At this point, Sheriff Clark had his counts about Christopher and suspected him of hiding some vital information under his sleeves. This he promptly communicated to the FBI, who assumed Christopher was hiding some information, probably to cover up his best friend. Or perhaps he feared being an accomplice. Should he have stated all he knew on the missing girl? Sheriff Clark, however, promised to get the truth out of Christopher. As he said, they had quite a relationship. Christopher had initially gone to see Colleen, Rowan's mom, to ask about any impending progress in the search for her daughter. But he came across some FBI agents who also came to the same location to question Colleen on some issues. On seeing Christopher, the agents took their chance and engaged him in further questioning. He, however, repeated the same story he had always said to them. But for the first time in this case, Christopher made a new, shocking revelation. Christopher, who was now willing to help, probably after seeing the state of Colleen, expressed his suspicions at his friend David, who was the stepfather of the missing girl. He refused to rule out any possibility that he didn't have a hand in it. In this case, this was a big lead, as Christopher was a best friend to the suspect, which could mean he was trying to leave a cryptic message for the police about David's involvement in the crime. He even went as far as asking to wear a wire, and probably tried to make his best friend confess. But the police saw that as an extremity and opted out of the plan. They only asked if Christopher knew any possible hideouts David may have that may be used to hide a body. He named quite a few, and the police swung into action immediately, checking all the hideouts listed by Christopher. They also brought David in for more questioning, but he was bent on his previous story. They even went as far as searching his house, but it was a dead end. Meanwhile, Christopher had organized another meeting with Sheriff Clark, speaking about his ordeal with the FBI agents some few months ago. This conversation intensified the sheriff's belief that Christopher had an idea as to what happened to the missing girl, and thus, he promptly communicated to the detectives. They urged him to keep up the pressure, reiterating that Christopher wanted to confide in him, but probably just needed some time to process the implications. The police, however, asked one more favor from Christopher. On November 7th, the police requested the presence of Christopher in the police station as they needed his consent on a pressing issue. Christopher had initially lived with David in the past, owing to the fact that he had no place of his own at the time. However, most of his belongings remained there, even when he had moved out. Among these belongings was a safe, and the police required his permission to break into it. Christopher not only gave them permission to open the safe, but also permission to search his trailer and his car. Christopher further left a sample of his DNA and reassured the police of his full cooperation. The police finally saw their chance. In a bid to seize the opportunity that presented itself, the police applied more pressure on Christopher, who at this point showed that he definitely knew something about the event. Christopher didn't take this too lightly, as he became agitated at the fact the police saw him as a criminal, and he vowed not to be of assistance anymore. Storming out, he went directly to Sheriff Clark. He narrated his ordeal and threatened to get a lawyer should the pressure get any worse. He also added that he knew he could only trust the sheriff and that he would speak to him and only him. Sheriff Clark saw his chance to get the most sought-after information and applied pressure, but this time with a little prudence. And at this point, Christopher made a most shocking reaction. Christopher had an outburst of tears. He expressed his deep affection for Rowan and how much he cherished the fact that he was accepted as one of their family members by all in the family. However, just when Christopher was at the brink of exposing this information, some person arrived at the police station, distracting the whole process. Eventually, he left without spilling any useful information yet again. Sheriff Clark reported his ordeal with Christopher to the detectives yet again, supplicating that they give Christopher some time to communicate this information on his terms, warning that further pressure may prompt him to get an attorney which would mean no information whatsoever for anyone. The detectives readily agreed and continued their search for Rowan. However, they weren't successful in their quest. This left them disappointed. Unknown to them, they were about to make their first breakthrough in this case. November 9 signaled a week since the mysterious disappearance of Rowan from the Stella community. Search groups had started searching neighboring towns in a bid to cover more ground. However, when they got to a small town called Powell, which was situated about 10 miles from Stella, search groups found something scary in the midst of the trees and fields. They discovered a large pit, and behold, Rowan's lifeless body was resting beneath it, covered in leaves, with her clothes missing. Experts had examined the body and determined the cause of death to be strangulation. The examination also confirmed a possible forced violation of her. Immediately after the body was found, Sheriff Clark was contacted and was asked to further interrogate Christopher, if he would be willing to talk now that the body was found. However, Christopher, who was already agitated, had visited earlier on to speak with the sheriff but probably didn't meet him. The sheriff, learning about this, set out to look for Christopher in places he figured he may be, all to no avail. However, Christopher, who was in distress, called the sheriff, claiming he was being followed, and that scared him greatly. He claimed after the news of Rowan's body being found, a certain gray-colored car had been following him around. He claimed the person may be someone who mistakes him for the murderer and may want to take revenge. The sheriff denied any knowledge of such. However, he opted to meet Christopher in person. When they met, Christopher could be seen trembling and in fear. It was almost certain he knew what had happened, and the information was just a matter of time. Clark took him to the station, as the case had already been classified a homicide, so Christopher was obligated to state what he knew about the crime. Initially, he agreed, but opted to do it at a more private area, considering the amount of people that were present in the police station. He suggested a quiet bridge, which was some few miles away. They both agreed and went on their way there. When they got there, Christopher did something very shocking. When they got out of the car, Christopher brought out both his hands and gestured at the sheriff to place him in handcuffs. The sheriff, who was already surprised at this point, stated that there was no need for that. Christopher, however, said that when he had told the sheriff what he was going to say, the sheriff was going to handcuff him anyway. At this point, Christopher made a very shocking revelation. At first, he narrated the same story he had maintained all along, but then he added some parts he left out all along. He claimed he planned to forcibly violate Rowan, so when David and Nathan had opted to take the longer road, knowing fully well they were going to take some time, he drove straight to David's house, but this time taking the main road, which was obviously the quicker path on getting there first. He went straight to Rowan's room, taking her back to his car. He claimed he tried to do it in a subtle way so as not to wake her up, but this didn't work as planned. After achieving his mission, which she tried to resist but couldn't, he planned to take her back in the dark so she wouldn't recognize him. But the moon shone so brightly, as if in a bid to expose this abominable act of his, and in an instant Rowan recognized her stepfather's friend. This was when he took the next dreadful step. Christopher, discovering his identity had been compromised, panicked in an instant, causing him to kill Rowan by strangulation. He then thought of dropping her body from the bridge, but objected to doing that because he felt her body would be found too soon. This was when he remembered a certain pit near the neighboring town, and when he tried to place her in and cover her with leaves, both the leaves and Rowan's body all fell into the pit, owing to its size, thus spoiling Christopher's master plan. He then went back to his trailer to eliminate any incriminating evidence that may link him to the murder of the 9-year-old. This included her blood, her underwear, and the rope he used in killing her. These he placed in a barrel in a bid to burn them all. However, he was concerned about the attention such wildfire would arouse, so he developed a master plan that would enable him to carry out the act without notice from the public. Sheriff Clark was beyond surprised while the story was being narrated. He couldn't believe what he heard at that moment. And this was due to the fact that he had known Christopher for 20 years, and all those years, he had always appeared to him as someone decent and impeccable. Hearing this ordeal took him aback and left him shattered and surprised. However, the law had to take its course. Christopher, who was aware of this, offered himself up for arrest. However, the sheriff simply led him without handcuffs to the FBI, where he narrated the whole ordeal one more time. Christopher was immediately arrested on the charges of murder, while signing a voluntary consent that would see his truck thoroughly searched. He expressed deep regret over his actions. However, not even this show of immense regret could undo the damage this terrible action had caused. The police's next line of action was to report these new discoveries to David, Rowan's stepfather. However, they were met with an even more surprising twist of events. He claimed that when he got home and discovered Rowan's absence, he knew instantly that she was taken by Christopher. At this point, he took his mother's car, searching for them. And alas, he found them. However, instead of saving his stepdaughter, he made this next dreadful step. When he found them, Rowan was on the bed with Christopher, and he decided to join him in violating his stepdaughter, after which he assisted in killing and disposing of her body. He added that he wasn't in the right frame of mind when all these had transpired. The detectives, who were taken aback by this revelation, couldn't believe their ears and had to confirm this with Christopher. However, Christopher gave a different narrative, further complicating the case. Christopher claimed the story was just as he initially said, and, truth be told, the evidence on the ground matched that fact. However, David had made a big claim and couldn't go unpunished, so he too was immediately arrested. They were both charged to court. While the trial had begun, Christopher attempted to withdraw his statements, claiming he was unaware they could be used against him. He also attributed his abominable act to his rough childhood, claiming he showed signs of developmental issues. These claims fell on deaf ears, as in 2005, which was 5 years after the murder, Christopher Collins was sentenced to death for the murder of Rowan Ford. He tried to appeal his sentence, but he was unsuccessful. David, on the other hand, had to be met with a lighter sentence, which would not interfere with Christopher's sentence being withdrawn, as both forensic and every available evidence pointed in his direction. David was slammed with a total of 11 years of prison service, with a minimum of 5 years behind bars. Now, many would state that justice had been served, but with the inconclusiveness of this case, we can only help but imagine and ask ourselves these questions. Was David involved in the killing of his stepdaughter? If he was, why was Christopher particular about taking all the blame? And if David was innocent, what reaction would you have expected he took upon hearing his friend was responsible for the death of his stepdaughter? We would love to know your thoughts in the comment section. And as usual, do not forget to drop a like for your favorite YouTube channel, and if you haven't already done so, please do well to subscribe to enjoy more of our mystery-filled episodes.